Pay attention to this security camera footage. In Flint, Michigan, a CCTV camera mounted in the back hallway of a night shelter captured exactly 27 seconds. You see a 49-year-old white woman with a purse slung over her shoulder, wearing a thin jacket, stepping out from the duty room where she had just finished her Sunday night volunteer shift. She pauses, reaches to turn off the hallway light switch, bends down to lock the metal door according to procedure. A few seconds later, from the end of the hallway, a man appears. He stands still, doesn't move closer, doesn't touch her. The two exchange a few words that the camera doesn't pick up audio for. No tension, no signs of danger. Then the woman walks ahead, the man follows behind, and both leave the frame via the rear exit. At 11:14 p.m., the hallway is empty. That was the last time Rebecca Lawson was seen alive. The next morning, the system recorded that she had clocked out and completed her shift safely. The shelter opened as usual. No one called the police, no one searched. 12 days later, investigators opened the door to an abandoned warehouse near Saginaw and discovered Rebecca Lawson's body. Most people thought this was a regrettable missing person case involving a volunteer. Wrong. This was not an accident. This was not random, and it began with those seemingly ordinary seconds of footage that no one thought needed to be reviewed again. Rebecca Lawson, an experienced Sunday night volunteer, completed a completely normal Sunday shift at the night shelter in Flint, Michigan, locking the bed list, noting a few familiar violations, preparing to leave just like every previous week. An administrative glitch. Maybe she forgot to confirm clock out. Maybe the system auto-completed the shift. Maybe she went home as usual. Wrong place, wrong time, a vague disappearance. The kind of thing people assume can still happen in an overloaded system where volunteers come and go every night. That's what the shelter believed in those first hours. That's how the records noted it. That's everyone's assumption. Wrong. This was not an administrative error. This was not a normal shift departure. And it had nothing to do with Rebecca forgetting to do something or not doing something. Because the man who appeared familiar in that shelter, the man who didn't cause trouble, the man who always lingered late on Sunday nights, had been waiting for exactly this moment. His name was Ethan Moore, 37 years old, no violent criminal record, no stable job, no fixed address. To staff and volunteers, he was a familiar face, quiet, well-behaved, sometimes even helping carry things and clean up. The kind of person not flagged as dangerous. The kind of person the system is designed to believe is harmless. Before talking about Ethan, it needs to be said about Rebecca, because she deserves that. She deserves to be seen as a person, not as a missing entry in a file. Rebecca was 49, had lived her whole life in Flint, worked full-time during the day and gave her Sunday nights to the shelter for nearly 10 years. She chose that shift because few people wanted it, because it was quiet, because that was when people with no other options needed someone to stay until the very end. Rebecca received no pay, held no power, only handled the operational tasks few noticed. Checking areas, logging violations, entering data, signing confirmations, closing the shift. She followed procedure exactly, no more, no less. Over time, the name Ethan Moore appeared more and more in internal notes. Overstaying, accessing restricted areas, lingering near staff zones. No arguments, no confrontations, just lines of data entered into the system per protocol. Rebecca issued no private warnings. Ethan made no public reactions. Everything happened silently, correctly, and completely invisibly. And just like many other systems, this shelter was built on one simple assumption. If no incident is reported, then the shift ended safely. Ethan Moore didn't know exactly when things started slipping out of control, only that it didn't happen in the shelter, didn't happen in front of anyone, but happened when he overheard a brief exchange between two staff members about the file being forwarded to the county management system, and from that moment, Ethan understood that the scattered notes once appearing under his name were no longer within the scope of a single shift or a single volunteer, but had become stored data, synced data, and most importantly, data that could not be retracted or edited. For Ethan, the shelter wasn't just a temporary place to stay. It was the last anchor in a chain of things long broken. No stable home, no long-term job, no family to return to. Every rhythm of his life revolved around locations that allowed him to exist through the night without too many questions. Being banned from the county-wide shelter system meant no alternative options, no legal fallback, no minimal structure to maintain daily survival. Ethan understood very clearly how this system operated. Once a file was flagged at management level, every linked facility saw the same information, the same conclusion, and every door would slam shut at once. In his perception, the issue was no longer minor violations or overstaying, but the existence of an official record stating he was a risk, an individual not permitted to return. Ethan also quickly realized what he could not accept most. That report wasn't signed by some anonymous manager, but entered by Rebecca Lawson, the person he still saw every Sunday night, the person sitting behind the duty desk, the person who didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't issue any personal warnings. It was precisely that silence and procedural correctness that made Ethan understand there was no room for negotiation, no one to beg, and no way to fix it with words. In Ethan's mind, Rebecca was no longer a well-meaning volunteer or a separate individual. She became the single fixed point in the chain of causes leading to his impending removal from the system. The clearest, most identifiable, and most dangerous link. Ethan's initial thought was not to kill. It revolved around applying pressure, forcing Rebecca to admit the report was just a mistake, forcing her to correct it, or at least blur the entries made. But the more he thought, the more Ethan understood the system didn't work that way. That once data was stored, Rebecca's role was complete, and her very existence as the person who entered the report was the real risk. In cold, emotion-detached calculation, Ethan reached a conclusion that to him felt more logical than violent. If Rebecca continued to exist to confirm, to witness, to answer any questions from management or authorities, then the risk of permanent ban was irreversible. The decision to eliminate Rebecca did not come from personal hatred, not from explosive anger, but from a simple calculation of legal consequences and his own survival odds, where one person was reduced to a variable, and removing that variable was seen as the only way to delay or prevent the total collapse of the life Ethan was trying to hold on to. After concluding that Rebecca Lawson was an unavoidable variable, Ethan Moore did not act immediately but began observing with the cold patience of someone accustomed to living in the gaps of the system. He didn't follow her in the traditional sense, but only paid attention to the repeating elements in her routine every Sunday night. The time Rebecca finished her shift always fell within a narrow, little varying window. After completing the final entries, she locked the service area, turned off the auxiliary hallway lights, and left the shelter via the same rear exit. This path wasn't at the front, had no foot traffic, and usually only had fixed security lighting. Most importantly, Rebecca always left alone because the Sunday night shift had no other volunteers ending at the same time, and security staff didn't have fixed patrol positions. Those details weren't prominent, didn't draw attention, but to Ethan, they formed a complete logical chain, showing Rebecca existed in a very brief window between when the system believed the shift had ended and when no one was actually watching. Ethan understood clearly how the shelter operated on weekends. No direct manager present after a certain hour. Any issues arising handled the next morning unless there was an emergency alert. The CCTV system installed mainly to record, rather than monitor in real time, and footage only reviewed when there was a clear incident, while the semi-automatic clock-out procedure allowed shift completion if no errors were logged within a set period, meaning a shift could be considered ended by the system even if the person in charge hadn't actually left the premises. In Ethan's calculation, these loopholes weren't flaws but favorable conditions, because they created a gray zone where Rebecca's absence could be explained as a normal departure in those first many hours. Importantly, at that point, Ethan wasn't building a complete murder plan. He didn't select a kill site, didn't prepare specific tools or means of attack, and didn't envision a violent outcome from the start. The only thing prepared was a discreet means of transport to get Rebecca away from the shelter without drawing attention, a step viewed as a temporary measure to create controlled space and extend time. Ethan's entire preparation chain revolved around delaying the system's response, not confronting it head-on. He believed that if Rebecca simply didn't appear to confirm or explain in the initial time frame, that report would be re-examined or at least suspended in internal procedures. Ethan's biggest strategic mistake lay in underestimating the value of passive data, especially CCTV data. He believed a camera, not actively monitored and not recording violence, was essentially harmless, that the static, blurry, soundless frames weren't enough to create a clear story. Ethan also believed the clock-out system error would precisely cover the moment Rebecca vanished, that in administrative records, she would be logged as having completed her shift and left per procedure, and thus any delay in contact or missing person report could be attributed to personal reasons not warranting alarm. More importantly, Ethan believed the shelter wouldn't trigger an immediate response, that in an environment accustomed to people coming and going, a volunteer's absence wouldn't instantly be treated as a serious incident. This belief allowed him to proceed without feeling pressed by time. Every step in the preparation phase rested on the assumption that the system prioritized smooth flow over vigilance, that without clear anomalous signals everything would be handled slowly, and it was precisely in that delay that Ethan believed he could resolve the issue in the way most favorable to himself. Not through immediate violence, but by making Rebecca's presence ambiguous, hard to pinpoint, and easy to overlook in the first hours after the shift was supposed to have ended. That Sunday night unfolded exactly like the nights before. Rebecca Lawson completed the end-of-shift tasks in the familiar sequence, double-checking the bed list, cross-referencing the logbook, entering the final lines of data into the internal system, locking the service areas, and gradually turning off the lights in the unused hallways. No arguments, no disruptive guests, no signals that an incident was forming inside the shelter. Everything was quiet to the point of boredom, true to the nature of the Sunday night shift that Rebecca had grown accustomed to over many years. The security camera mounted in the back hallway recorded her leaving the duty room with her familiar purse over her shoulder, walking at a slow, unhurried pace, the rhythm of someone who had finished work and was preparing to head home. A few seconds later, in the same frame, Ethan Moore appeared from the far end of the hallway. No running, no covering his face, no carrying anything attention-grabbing. His appearance triggered no warning reaction because this was an area where guests still passed through before closing time. The camera continued to capture a brief period as Rebecca paused, turned her head toward Ethan. The two stood within the lens's view but showed no tense gestures, no physical contact, no violent behavior, no sound, just a short exchange that couldn't be read from the blurry, silent footage. Then Rebecca continued walking toward the rear exit, Ethan following at a distance close enough to stay in frame, far enough to not feel threatening. In the final seconds the camera recorded, both left the frame in the same direction. And that was everything the system captured. No dragging, no resistance. Nothing clear enough to be considered criminal behavior if looking only at that footage. From that point onward, Rebecca no longer appeared on any camera within the shelter grounds. No one saw her step out to the front parking lot. No one saw her turn back inside. And because the system considered the shift completed, no alerts were triggered in those first hours. Rebecca's departure from the shelter happened in a perfect blind spot of attention where there were no direct witnesses and every assumption leaned toward her having gone home as usual. She was led out of the shelter premises quietly, not through overt violence, but through guidance based on routine and familiarity. A movement not abnormal enough to catch anyone's eye if someone happened to pass by. No distress calls, no emergency signals, no demands sent out, and no signs that this was a conventional kidnapping. The time afterward passed in silence, while Rebecca was held at an abandoned warehouse in a sparsely populated industrial area near Saginaw, a location not pre-selected as a kill site, but simply a temporary space, discreet enough to avoid attention and extend time. Throughout the period of confinement, there was no contact with family, no ransom, no attempt to negotiate with the shelter or authorities, because the purpose of holding Rebecca was not to demand or bargain, but to delay, control, and prevent her presence in the processes Ethan believed were unfolding elsewhere in parallel. Hours stretched on in makeshift conditions with no outside intervention. And it was precisely that extension that began to change the nature of the situation. The longer Rebecca remained missing, the greater the risk of discovery, and with it, the collapse of the initial assumption that creating a delay would be enough to blur her role. During that period, the decision to kill did not come immediately, but formed gradually amid the realization that temporary confinement no longer achieved the original goal. Rebecca could not correct the report, could not retract the stored data, and her existence, even hidden in a closed space, remained an uncontrollable risk if she ever returned, or if any questions arose about what happened that Sunday night. The decision to kill emerged as a belated escalation not prepared from the start, not accompanied by a perfect plan or clear script, but as the consequence of a chain of choices meant to buy time that ultimately narrowed every escape route, where eliminating Rebecca came to be seen as the only way to end the uncertainty Ethan had created for himself. Throughout the entire sequence, CCTV recorded no violent acts, witnessed no decisive moment, provided no images of the holding location or the death, but it was precisely the chilling normalcy of those final frames where Rebecca left the duty room and Ethan appeared as a familiar part of the shelter space that became the silent timestamp, marking the boundary between a shift considered complete and a chain of events no one realized was unfolding beyond the system's view. In the first hours after that Sunday night, the shelter recorded no incidents because the semi-automatic clockout system completed Rebecca Lawson's shift. According to default procedure, no errors triggered, no alerts activated, and in the administrative records, she was logged as having left safely, just like every previous week. That assumption carried into the next day when no one at the shelter noticed her absence as unusual, since Rebecca's work schedule consisted solely of one shift per week. Rebecca's family began to worry when they couldn't reach her the following evening, and only then did they file a missing person report, leading the case to be handled initially as a standard missing person situation. No signs of violence, no demands, no clear crime scene. In the early days, the investigation focused on personal hypotheses such as communication issues or voluntary departure. Only when police began reviewing Rebecca's final schedule at the shelter did some inconsistencies gradually emerge. The clockout data showed the shift completed, but there was no physical confirmation of Rebecca leaving the premises, no access card log at the main gate, and no footage from the front cameras, showing her walking to the parking lot as usual. Initial review of the CCTV data yielded no clear results because there was no violence or struggle captured. But when the back hallway footage was analyzed more closely against the precise timeline, investigators realized Rebecca had not been alone in those final seconds. Ethan Moore was present, leaving the frame with her and recorded as the last person standing beside Rebecca on shelter grounds. Identifying Ethan did not stem from overtly suspicious behavior, but from the match in timing and location. He appeared in the right place at the right time, and afterward there were no further images of Rebecca in the shelter's camera system. From this point, the investigation shifted to reconstructing the departure route from the premises. Investigators began cross-referencing data from nearby traffic cameras, focusing on vehicles leaving the area around the shelter in the short window after Rebecca vanished. This process led to identifying a vehicle linked to Ethan Moore, traveling along a route inconsistent with his usual patterns, heading toward the sparsely populated industrial area near Saginaw, where many disused facilities received little monitoring. When that area was narrowed down, an inactive old warehouse became the focal point due to signs of recent access inconsistent with its abandoned status. Examination of the site led to the discovery of Rebecca Lawson's body, with evidence indicating she had been held prior to death, confirming her absence was not voluntary disappearance or a personal mishap, but the result of a deliberate chain of actions. Time of death was determined to be significantly later than when she left the shelter, reinforcing that Rebecca remained alive for a period after disappearing from camera view. Based on the combined CCTV data, traffic data, and evidence collected at the scene, Ethan Moore was arrested in under 2 weeks from when Rebecca was reported missing and charged in connection with kidnapping and murder, closing the investigation phase by linking the scattered pieces of data he had believed the system would overlook in those first hours and days. The Rebecca Lawson case forced the relevant agencies to re-examine the entire operational chain that had allowed a disappearance to stretch for hours without triggering any alerts, starting with a shift being considered complete by the system based solely on automatic logic without human confirmation. Continuing with a lone volunteer working the night shift, able to leave the premises without anyone checking destination or safety status. And finally, with CCTV existing as a passive recording tool, rather than an active monitoring layer. These vulnerabilities were not designed to create danger, but when combined, they formed a perfect gap where a person could vanish without sending any emergency signal in the initial hours. The post-case review focused not on blaming individuals, but on acknowledging that an operating model built on trust and familiarity was no longer suitable for the real risks volunteers face when working alone at night. Shelters in the area implemented procedural changes, completely eliminating solo closing shifts, requiring at least 2 people to end shifts together, and establishing mandatory manual confirmation steps before a shift is considered complete in the system. In parallel, the CCTV system was upgraded not only in equipment but in usage, with real-time monitoring required during sensitive hours and motion alerts triggered for unusual activity after closing time. The clock-out procedure was revised to require dual confirmation, combining system data with physical verification to prevent a shift from being marked complete on paper while the responsible person had not yet safely left the premises. On a broader level, the case sparked a wave of self-assessment across the overnight volunteer community, where many organizations had to admit that goodwill and dedication cannot substitute for basic safety measures, and that those willing to stay latest to help people with no other options are precisely the ones most vulnerable to unseen risks. The societal impact of the case went beyond procedural changes to a shift in perception that volunteer safety must be treated as an inseparable part of the humanitarian mission. Because if the system is not robust enough to protect those on the front line, then the very values it pursues become fragile in the face of the gaps Rebecca Lawson unwittingly stepped into and never stepped out of. If Rebecca Lawson's story has made you recognize the hidden risks behind shifts that seem safe, please subscribe to the channel to keep following cases where a single overlooked moment changed everything. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue telling the stories the system once believed were closed.